The air in Aura was a carefully curated symphony of wealth. It smelled of ancient money and freshly shaved truffles, a fragrance that clung to the velvet ropes and the damask tablecloths. The sound was a hushed orchestra of clinking silver against bone china, and the low, confident murmur of voices that decided the fate of nations and markets between sips of $100 wine. Above, crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations, scattering fractured light across the faces of the city's titans. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the metropolis sprawled below, a glittering tapestry of light and ambition. And moving through this gilded sanctuary was Elara Vance, a ghost in a perfectly starched black uniform. To the patrons, she was an extension of the decor, a pair of hands that refilled water glasses and cleared plates with silent, practiced efficiency. They saw her, but they did not see her. They looked through her, their eyes fixed on the panoramic view, on their dining companions, on the reflection of their own success in the polished glass. Elara had perfected this invisibility. She had weaponized it. It was a cloak that allowed her to observe, to listen, and to remember everything, all while her face remained a mask of placid professionalism. Beneath that mask, however, a different world churned. While her hands were steady, pouring a vintage Bordeaux into a delicate glass, her mind was a tempest of stress-strain curves and tensile strength calculations. Every glance out the window was not one of admiration for the skyline, but a critical analysis of the structural loads on the surrounding towers. Her thoughts were not of tips or tired feet, but of her father, Marcus Vance. She saw him not as the architectural visionary the world had once celebrated, but as he was now, a man trapped in a body betrayed by a catastrophic stroke, his brilliant mind locked behind eyes that could no longer command his limbs or voice. The weight of his medical bills, a staggering 5-figure sum each month, was the invisible anchor that chained her to this life of servitude. She had been a prodigy herself, a doctoral candidate at MIT, her name whispered in the halls as the heir to the Vance genius. Now that life was a distant, painful memory, a ghost of a future she had sacrificed to keep her father alive. Every condescending glance from a patron, every dismissive wave of a hand, was a stone she added to the foundation of her resolve. They saw a waitress. She knew she was a guardian, a daughter fueled by a love so fierce it bordered on silent, righteous fury. The carefully balanced atmosphere of the restaurant shifted when Alistair Finch arrived. It was not a loud disruption, but a subtle change in pressure, like a predator entering a clearing. The maitre d', a man who regularly greeted senators without flinching, seemed to shrink by an inch, his smile becoming just a little too tight. Finch moved through the space not as a guest, but as a conqueror surveying his domain. His suit, a tailored slash of midnight blue, was less a piece of clothing and more a suit of armor, broadcasting a message of untouchable power. He didn't walk, he glided, his hand-stitched leather shoes making no sound on the polished marble, as if the very floor was afraid to speak in his presence. He exuded an aura of cold, transactional contempt. He did not acknowledge the staff who parted before him. To him, they were obstacles to be navigated, not people to be seen. Elara felt his presence before she saw him, a drop in the room's temperature, a prickling on her skin that was part instinct, part memory. He chose the prime table, the one with the most commanding view of the city, and, more importantly, of the skeletal behemoth rising into the night sky, the Finch Apex Tower. Seated with a prominent journalist, Finch began to hold court. His voice was not loud, but it carried, a resonant baritone that sliced through the restaurant's gentle hum. He spoke of his tower not as a building, but as a legacy, a testament to his singular vision. He used words like synergy and paradigm and disruption, weaving them into a narrative of self-congratulation that was both nauseating and mesmerizing. The journalist hung on every word, his pen scratching furiously across a notepad. Elara moved towards their table, a silver water pitcher in her hand, her movements fluid and economical. She kept her eyes downcast, a portrait of deference, but her ears were finely tuned instruments absorbing every syllable. The tower, his tower, was a steel and glass monument to a lie. It was a physical manifestation of her family's ruin, its skeletal frame, a constant, agonizing reminder of the life that had been stolen from them. Her father's dream, twisted and rebranded by the man who had destroyed him, now dominated the very skyline her father had taught her to love, to read, to understand as a living, breathing entity. Then, with a flourish of theatricality, Finch unrolled a section of the blueprints onto the white linen tablecloth. The crisp, blue and white paper was an alien object in this world of fine dining, a piece of the construction site brought into the sanctuary. For Ilara, the sight of it was a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat. She recognized the design language instantly, the elegant, sweeping lines, the revolutionary use of cantilevered sections. It was her father's architectural handwriting, as unique and familiar to her as his own signature. It was a piece of his soul, laid bare on a table for this charlatan to claim as his own. And as her eyes scanned the intricate lines, her practiced, expert gaze caught it. A small, almost imperceptible modification to the damping system at a critical structural junction. It was a change born of ego, a tweak made by an inferior mind trying to put its own stamp on a masterpiece. To a layman, it was nothing. To Finch, it was probably a cost-saving measure or a minor aesthetic adjustment, but to Ilara, with her father's lifetime of knowledge imprinted on her very DNA, the Flaw screamed. It was a microfracture waiting to happen, a catastrophic failure coded into the building's very bones. Finch, oblivious, pointed to the exact section, his finger tracing the lines with a proprietary air. He was attempting to explain a key structural concept to the journalist, a principle of harmonic resonance that was central to her father's unique philosophy of creating buildings that could breathe and flex with environmental stressors. But his explanation was a caricature of the truth, a jumble of technical terms misused to make him sound like a visionary. He spoke of dominating the wind, of forcing the structure into submission, a philosophy so fundamentally opposed to her father's idea of working in harmony with nature that it felt like a desecration. A hot, acidic anger rose in Ilara's throat. She could hear her father's voice in her memory, patiently explaining the elegant physics to a 10-year-old version of herself, using a blade of grass bending in the wind as his model. Finch was not just a thief, he was an idiot, a man who had stolen a symphony and was now trying to conduct it with a stick, completely deaf to the music. The words escaped her before she could stop them. They were not loud, barely a murmur, a whisper of pure, unadulterated truth that cut through Finch's self-important monologue. A quiet correction about harmonic resonance in the cantilever design. The phrase, so technical, so out of place, hung in the air between them. The journalist's pen froze mid-sentence. Finch stopped talking, his mouth still half open. The silence that descended upon the table was sudden and absolute. For a single, stretched-out second, the entire universe of the restaurant seemed to pivot on that one whispered sentence. It was the sound of a mask slipping, of a ghost suddenly taking form. Ilara's own heart hammered against her ribs. She had broken the cardinal rule of her existence. She had allowed herself to be seen. She had spoken. And in doing so, she had just lit the fuse on a bomb that had been dormant for years, a bomb she didn't even know she was ready to detonate. Alistair Finch turned his head slowly, his eyes, the color of polished steel, fixing on her for the first time. He didn't see a structural engineering prodigy. He saw a waitress, a piece of the furniture that had dared to speak. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face, a predator enjoying the moment before the kill. The air crackled with his contempt. The journalist looked back and forth between them, sensing a story far more interesting than the one he had been writing down. Finch leaned back in his chair, making a grand, dismissive gesture. He was going to make an example of her. The humiliation was meant to be public, a lesson for any other piece of furniture that might consider having an opinion. As he opened his mouth to speak, to deliver the crushing, condescending blow, Ilara's mind became a fortress. The image of her father, frail and silent in his medical bed, burned behind her eyes. The mountain of debt, the years of swallowed pride, the righteous, burning grief for a stolen legacy, it all coalesced into a single point of cold, diamond-hard resolve. Let him speak, let him mock her. He had no idea who he was talking to. He was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive into the confrontation that will change everything, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. The stage is set for a clash not just of intellects, but of worlds. And if you believe that justice is a dish best served cold, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because you are about to witness an incredible story of resilience and righteous vindication unfold right here in the heart of New York City. You're about to see what happens when the most arrogant man in the city underestimates the wrong person and in doing so hands her the very key to his own destruction. The billionaire's sneer was a masterpiece of condescension, a carefully crafted expression designed to shrink her down to nothing, to remind her of her place in the gilded ecosystem of aura. His words, dripping with scorn, were not just a dismissal, but an attempt at annihilation, yet they did not have their intended effect. Instead of withering, something inside Alara Vance shifted, a tectonic plate of long-suppressed identity grinding into place. The years of servitude, the swallowed insults, the crushing weight of her father's medical bills, all of it had been a crucible, forging her resolve into something harder than the steel skeleton of the tower that loomed outside the window. The image of her father, his brilliant mind, trapped in a silent prison of flesh, flashed behind her eyes, not as a source of pity, but as a banner for a war she had just declared. The fury that had been a low, simmering ember in her soul for half a decade finally found oxygen. It did not erupt in a blaze of hot, uncontrolled rage, but instead solidified into a core of glacial calm, a chilling, absolute certainty that transformed her from a ghost in a uniform into an avenging angel. The universe, which moments ago had been a chaotic symphony of clinking glasses and hushed conversations, narrowed to a single, silent point of confrontation. It began with her posture, a subtle, almost imperceptible change that radiated an authority that was utterly alien to her role as a waitress. Her shoulders, which had been held in a posture of professional deference, squared and straightened, as if an invisible mantle had been settled upon them. Her spine, which had been slightly curved in the constant motion of service, became a rigid pillar of defiance. She lifted her chin, her gaze rising from the polished floor to meet Alistair Finch's eyes directly, without a trace of the fear or subservience he expected, that he demanded from the world. Her eyes, which had been professionally vacant moments before, now held a focus so intense it was like looking into the heart of a forge. They were no longer the eyes of a servant, they were the eyes of an expert, a judge, and a jury. The silver water pitcher in her hand, once a tool of her trade, now seemed to rest in her grip with the balanced weight of a scepter. The air around the table grew thick and heavy, charged with the energy of a paradigm shifting. The journalist, a man accustomed to the predictable orbits of power, felt a primal shiver of anticipation. He was witnessing something extraordinary, the birth of a story far more profound than the one he had been tasked to write. When Alara spoke, her voice was unrecognizable. The polite, soft-spoken murmur of the waitress was gone, replaced by a tone of crystalline clarity and unnerving precision. It was a voice that carried no heat, no anger, only the cold, immutable weight of fact. She did not raise it, she did not need to. It cut through the silence like a surgeon's scalpel, each word perfectly enunciated, each syllable a hammer blow against the fragile edifice of Finch's ego. She extended a hand, her fingers long and steady, and pointed not at him, but at a specific intersection of lines on the blueprint he had so proudly displayed. It was a gesture of command, of an academic directing a student's attention to a fatal error. The entire restaurant, it seemed, held its breath, drawn into the magnetic field of this impossible confrontation. Her words were not an opinion, but a diagnosis. delivered with the chilling confidence of a physician pronouncing a terminal illness. The technical jargon flowed from her not as a clumsy attempt to impress, but as her native language, a language Finch had only ever crudely mimicked. She was no longer in his world, he was now terrifyingly in hers, and he was completely out of his depth. Her finger traced a path invisible to the layman's eye, a path of structural stress that her mind could see as clearly as a crack in pavement. She explained the precise nature of the flaw, the subtle but catastrophic miscalculation in his team's modification to the resonant damping system. She spoke of wind shear velocities, of oscillation frequencies, and of metal fatigue. Her explanation a symphony of engineering principles that was both elegant and devastating. She painted a vivid, terrifying picture for the journalist, a vision of the magnificent tower, under the strain of a predictable winter storm, developing a subtle, harmonic tremor. A tremor that would grow, amplified by the very design meant to protect it, until a microfracture formed at the exact junction she was indicating. From there, she explained, with cold, methodical detail, the failure would cascade, a domino effect of shearing bolts and buckling support beams, leading to a collapse so total, so catastrophic, it would be a tragedy etched into the city's history forever. She made the abstract concept of structural failure terrifyingly real, a ghost of the future she had summoned into the opulent dining room, a specter that now haunted the space between them. Then came the blow from which Alistair Finch would never recover. After laying the scientific groundwork with the precision of a demolition expert planting charges, Alara finally made it personal. She lifted her gaze from the blueprints and locked it onto his, her eyes holding him in place like a pinned specimen. The final piece of her revelation was delivered with the same chilling calm, but now it was imbued with the weight of a lifetime of pain and righteous fury. She spoke her father's name, Marcus Vance, and the name landed in the silent room with the force of a physical impact. To the journalist, it was a name from the history books, a fallen titan of architecture. To Finch, it was the name of the man he had destroyed, a ghost he thought he had long since buried under a mountain of legal documents and non-disclosure agreements. Alara watched the blood drain from his face, the mask of arrogant amusement cracking and crumbling away to reveal the panicked, hollow man beneath. The color of his skin shifted from a healthy, confident tan to a pallid ashen gray, a stark contrast to the rich mahogany of the chair he was sitting in. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. He was frozen, impaled by a name he never expected to hear again, especially not from the lips of a waitress. The final sentence was the eulogy for his stolen legacy. It was quiet, almost a whisper, yet it echoed in the cavernous silence of the restaurant. Alara didn't need to shout. The truth was her amplification. She connected the dots for the horrified journalist and for the man who had ruined her life, laying his crime bare on the pristine white tablecloth between the bread basket and the wine glasses. The theft, the incompetence, the arrogant oversight, it was all there. She had not merely corrected him, she had eviscerated him, stripping him of his stolen genius and leaving him exposed as nothing more than a common thief, a charlatan who had not even understood the treasure he had plundered. The journalist's jaw was slack, his pen forgotten on the table. He was staring at Alara as if she had just transformed into a different being entirely. In that moment, the power dynamic in the room in the city had irrevocably inverted. The invisible waitress had become the most powerful person at the table, and the billionaire titan of industry had been rendered utterly, humiliatingly powerless, silenced by the ghost of a man he had wronged and the unexpected fury of a daughter he never knew existed. For a long, stretched moment, Alistair Finch remained a statue of disbelief, his mind struggling to process the cataclysm that had just occurred. The carefully constructed world of his own narrative, where he was the visionary, the self-made genius, had been shattered by a whisper from a servant. Then, the shock curdled into a primal, volcanic rage. It was the fury of a king dethroned in his own court, the incoherent madness of a predator who had just been wounded by his intended prey. A dark, Mottled red flush crept up his neck, spreading across his face like a stain. A single vein pulsed violently at his temple, a visible testament to the storm of humiliation and fury raging within him. His hands, which had been resting elegantly on the table, clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists, the knuckles straining against the skin. The illusion of sophisticated power evaporated, replaced by the raw, ugly face of a bully who had been challenged and found wanting. He was no longer a captain of industry. He was a cornered animal, ready to lash out with every ounce of brute force he possessed. His voice, when it finally returned, was not the smooth, resonant baritone he used to command boardrooms. It was a ragged, guttural roar that ripped through the restaurant's hushed ambiance, causing heads to turn at every table. Patrons who had been meticulously ignoring the staff moments before were now staring, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths. The sound was a violation of the unspoken code of aura, a blast of raw, vulgar anger in a sanctuary of curated calm. He didn't use words at first, just a strangled noise of pure indignation. Then, pointing a trembling finger at Alara, a finger that shook not with age but with incandescent rage, he bellowed for the manager. It was not a request, it was a summons. The roar of a wounded lion demanding that its keepers dispose of the creature that had dared to prick its paw. He was reasserting his dominance in the only way he knew how, by demonstrating his power to destroy, to erase, to make people disappear. He needed to prove, to himself as much as to the journalist, that he was still in control. The maitre d', a man named Julien, who moved with the grace of a seasoned diplomat, appeared at the table almost instantly, his face a mask of professional panic. He had seen billionaires displeased, but he had never witnessed a meltdown of this magnitude. His eyes darted from Finch's contorted face to Alara's unnervingly calm demeanor, and he knew this was a disaster of unprecedented proportions. Julien began to stammer apologies, his entire being focused on placating the erupting volcano before him. He spoke of misunderstandings, of apologies, his words a desperate attempt to pour oil on the raging fire. But Finch was beyond reason. He wasn't interested in apologies. He wanted retribution. He wanted Alara gone. He wanted her erased from his sight, from the restaurant, from existence itself. He made his demand clear, his voice shaking with fury as he insisted she be fired immediately, on the spot, without a moment's hesitation. The demand was a public execution, a ritualistic display of his power over the lives of those he considered beneath him. Julien, trapped between the wrath of his most powerful client and the silent, defiant employee, made the only choice he could. His own livelihood, the reputation of the restaurant, depended on appeasing Alistair Finch. He turned to Alara, his expression a wretched mix of apology and command. The words of her termination were spoken softly, almost lost in the charged atmosphere, but they were final. She was to gather her things and leave the premises immediately. There was no severance, no discussion, just a swift, brutal severing. For Alara, the words were not a shock. She had known, from the moment she chose to speak, that this would be the consequence. As she looked at the terrified face of her manager and the triumphant, hate-filled glare of Alistair Finch, she felt a strange, unexpected sensation wash over her. It was not fear or regret. It was a profound sense of liberation. The chains of her servitude had just been broken. The cloak of invisibility she had worn for so long had been burned away, and for the first time in years she felt completely, terrifyingly, and gloriously visible. The walk from the dining room to the employee locker area was the longest of her life. It was a gauntlet of staring eyes and whispered condemnations. The other staff members averted their gazes, afraid to be associated with her defiance. The patrons watched with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination, as if observing a public shaming from a bygone era. Yet Alara did not cower. She walked with her head held high, her back straight, her steps measured and deliberate. She was no longer Alara the waitress. She was Alara Vance, daughter of Marcus Vance, and she was leaving the battlefield with her honor intact. Each step was a silent vow. This was not an end, it was a beginning. The humiliation he had intended for her had backfired, becoming instead the catalyst for her transformation. He had meant to silence her, but he had only given her a voice. He had meant to break her, but he had only forged her into a weapon. She was no longer just a guardian, she was now a warrior, and the war for her father's legacy had officially begun. As she changed out of her uniform for the last time, the starched black fabric felt like a shed skin. She folded it neatly, a final act of professionalism that was more for herself than for anyone else. In its place, she put on her simple street clothes, which felt like a suit of armor. In the cold, sterile light of the locker room, she looked at her reflection. The face staring back was no longer weary and resigned. There was a fire in her eyes, a hardness around her jaw that had not been there an hour before. The despair that had been her constant companion for years had been burned away by the clean, purifying heat of righteous anger. She had lost her job, her only source of income to pay for her father's care. By any rational measure, her situation was now infinitely worse. But in her heart, she knew the truth. She had just gained something far more valuable, a cause, a direction, a purpose beyond mere survival. She had found her fight. The heavy steel door of the service exit closed behind her with a deafening clang, the sound of a final, irrevocable separation from her old life. The cool night air of the city hit her face, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled perfection of Aura. She stood for a moment in the grimy back alley, the smells of refuse and exhaust replacing the scent of truffles and old money. The glittering skyline of New York City stretched out before her, a mountain range of human ambition. Her eyes immediately found it. The skeletal frame of the Finch Apex Tower, a dark silhouette against the starless sky. It no longer looked like a monument to her family's ruin. It now looked like a target. A wave of cold, terrifying reality washed over her. The loss of her income was not an abstract problem. It was an immediate crisis. The next payment for her father's care facility was due in 2 weeks. A sum that now seemed as impossibly high as the tower itself. For a moment, the sheer scale of the challenge threatened to overwhelm her, a suffocating wave of panic that made her knees feel weak. She took a deep breath, the gritty city air filling her lungs, grounding her. The panic receded, replaced by the cold, hard logic that had been her birthright. Despair was a luxury she could not afford. Fear was a weight she could not carry. What she needed now was not emotion, but a plan. Her mind, a precision instrument that had been dulled by years of disuse, began to whir back to life, processing variables, calculating odds, formulating strategies. Finch thought he had won. He thought he had swatted a fly, and that the incident was over. He had no idea that he had just armed his most dangerous enemy. He had underestimated her, and in his world of brutal, high-stakes competition, underestimation was a fatal mistake. It was the very same arrogance that led him to alter her father's perfect designs. The same hubris that would ultimately be his undoing. She knew his weakness now, and she would exploit it without mercy. The journey home on the subway was a descent from the heavens of the city's elite to the subterranean reality of its working class. The gleaming marble of Aura was replaced by graffiti-scarred plastic, the hushed murmurs by the screech of steel on steel. Surrounded by the tired, anonymous faces of the city, Ilara felt a strange sense of belonging. She was one of them, but she was also something more. She was a woman with a mission. The rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks was a drumbeat, counting down the time she had to act. Her thoughts were no longer on pouring wine or clearing plates, but on archival research, on legal precedents, on the precise documentation she would need to prove not just Finch's incompetence, but his fraud. She needed evidence, irrefutable proof that would stand up in a court of law, and, more importantly, in the court of public opinion. She needed to find her father's original plans. Her apartment was small, cramped, and filled with the ghosts of a life that could have been. Textbooks on structural dynamics and architectural theory lined the shelves, gathering dust. Her own dissertation, half finished, sat on her desk, a monument to a dream she had been forced to abandon. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and the faint antiseptic smell from her father's medical supplies. It was a world away from the opulence she had just left, a stark, constant reminder of everything she had lost. On the small kitchen table, a stack of envelopes sat like a silent accusation. Bills, invoices from the care facility, each one was a paper shackle, binding her to a life of quiet desperation. Tonight, however, she looked at them not with despair, but with a cold fury. They were no longer just debts to be paid. They were injustices to be rectified. They were fuel for the fire that now burned within her. She walked quietly into the small bedroom that had been converted into a medical suite. Her father was asleep, his breathing shallow but steady, regulated by the quiet hum and beep of the machines that surrounded his bed. His face, once so expressive and full of life, was now a placid mask. But Alara knew the brilliant mind was still there, trapped behind the veil of his illness. She sat in the chair beside his bed, a vigil she had kept for countless nights. She reached out and took his hand, his skin thin and cool to the touch. In the dim light, she made a silent promise to the man who had given her everything. She would not let his name be a footnote in the story of a lesser man. She would not let his legacy be a monument to a thief. She would get it back, all of it, the honor, the recognition, the truth. She would tear down Alistair Finch's empire of lies, and on its ruins, she would rebuild her father's name. With her resolve solidified into something unbreakable, she returned to the main room. Her eyes fell upon an old, cedar chest tucked away in a corner, a piece of furniture that had belonged to her father, filled with his old papers and memories. She knelt and lifted the heavy lid. The scent of aging paper and cedar wood filled the air, the smell of her childhood. Inside, beneath old photographs and personal letters, were his journals, thick, leather-bound volumes filled with his elegant, spidery handwriting. She pulled one out, her fingers tracing the familiar script, and then she saw it, her father's old address book, a relic from a pre-digital age. Her mind raced. Who would have known her father's work? Who would have hated Finch enough to help her? Who would have been a trusted confidant, someone Marcus Vance might have turned to when he first suspected Finch's betrayal? The name came to her like a whisper from the past. Professor Alistair Davies, a brilliant, iconoclastic engineering professor from Columbia, her father's closest friend, an intellectual sparring partner. Davies had been a vocal critic of Finch's predatory business practices years ago, and had been systematically pushed out of the lucrative world of consulting, his career effectively sabotaged by Finch's influence. He was a man with his own reasons to seek justice, a disgraced genius who might just be willing to help the daughter of his old friend. He was a long shot, a man who had retreated from the world, but he was the only shot she had. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she flipped through the worn pages of the address book, her fingers scanning the names until it landed on his. Davies. Alistair. There was a phone number, old and faded but still legible. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she picked up her phone. Her hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of taking the first concrete step towards the enemy. This was the moment of commitment. Once she made this call, there would be no turning back. She was stepping out of the shadows and onto the battlefield. She thought of Finch's smug, cruel face, of the journalist's shocked expression, of her father's silent, sleeping form. The combination of images steeled her nerves. She dialed the number, the tones beeping out into the quiet apartment, each one a declaration of intent. It rang once, twice, 3 times. She was about to hang up, a wave of disappointment washing over her, when a tired, gravelly voice answered on the 4th ring. A voice she hadn't heard in years, a voice that sounded weary, as if it carried the weight of a long and bitter defeat. She identified herself, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, a silence filled with the ghosts of the past. She could almost hear the professor's mind working, connecting her name to her father, connecting her father to the man who had ruined both of their lives. When he finally spoke again, the weariness in his voice was tinged with a faint spark of curiosity, the first flicker of a fire that had long since died down. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She told him where she had been working. And then she told him, with cold, technical precision, exactly what had happened at Aura less than an hour ago. She recounted her exchange with Finch, repeating her diagnosis of the fatal flaw in the Finch Apex Tower, the tower that should have been the Vance Apex Tower. Another long silence followed her explanation. This one was different. It was not a silence of confusion, but of dawning realization. The spark of curiosity in Professor Davies' voice was now a flame of righteous indignation. She had not just brought him a story of personal grievance. She had brought him a ticking time bomb, a matter of public safety wrapped in a tale of corporate malfeasance. She had brought him a chance to fight back, a chance to use his brilliant, sidelined mind for a cause that truly mattered. He had been a ghost for years, just like her, haunting the fringes of the world he once dominated. But her call, her story, was a summons. It was a chance for two ghosts to join forces and prove to the world that they were very, very real, and that their knowledge was a weapon more powerful than all of Alistair Finch's money and influence. The professor's voice, when he spoke again, had changed completely. The weariness was gone, replaced by a focused, analytical energy that Ilara remembered from his legendary university lectures. He didn't question her assessment. He knew the signature of Marcus Vance's genius, and he knew the signature of Alistair Finch's arrogant corner-cutting. He asked her a series of sharp, probing questions, testing her knowledge, confirming the details, his mind already mapping out the strategic challenges ahead. He knew, as she did, that her word alone, the word of a fired waitress, would mean nothing. They needed proof. They needed the original schematics, the ones with her father's signature and date, the ones that would predate any patent Finch had filed. They needed the paper trail, the evidence of the corporate espionage Finch had used to steal the project. It was a monumental task, a search for a needle in a haystack of corporate deceit. He agreed to meet her, not at his home, not at a public cafe, but at a place of sanctuary and power, the university's archival library, late the next night, long after the students and faculty had gone home. It was a place of forgotten knowledge, a mausoleum of paper and ink, the perfect place to begin their search for the truth. As Ilara hung up the phone, a sense of profound relief washed over her. She was no longer alone. She had an ally, a mentor, a fellow soldier who understood the enemy and the terrain of the coming battle. She looked again at the skeletal tower dominating the skyline. The fight was no longer just hers, it was theirs. And for the first time since her father's collapse, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of something she had thought was lost to her forever: hope. It was a small, fragile flame in the vast darkness, but it was enough. It was a start. The next evening, Ilara slipped through a side entrance of the university's main library, a place she hadn't set foot in since she had abandoned her doctorate. The familiar smell of old books and floor polish was a painful reminder of the life she had left behind, but tonight it felt different. It felt like coming home to an armory. Professor Davies was waiting for her in the deep, silent stacks of the architectural archives, a shadowy figure surrounded by towering shelves of forgotten knowledge. He looked older than she remembered, his face etched with the lines of past defeats, but his eyes burned with a renewed intensity. He had a large table cleared, illuminated by a single, green-shaded lamp, creating an island of light in the vast darkness. It felt like a war room, a clandestine headquarters for their two-person insurgency against a corporate empire. They were not just looking for a document, they were searching for a ghost. Professor Davies, with the weary pragmatism of a man who had seen too many battles lost, explained the immensity of their task. Alistair Finch had not just stolen a building, he had orchestrated a complete erasure of Marcus Vance from the historical record. He had spent millions on lawyers and public relations firms to ensure that his name, and his name alone, would be synonymous with the tower that was now scarring the city skyline. They needed more than a memory, more than Alara's expert testimony. They needed physical, undeniable, dated proof. They needed her father's hand, his ink, his signature on a piece of paper that predated Finch's web of lies. In the silent, cavernous library, surrounded by the collective knowledge of generations, Alara felt the true scale of the mountain she had to climb. It was a search for a single page in a library of deceit, a hunt for one true note in a symphony of falsehoods, and the clock was ticking, each second a beat, closer to the day her father's care would become an expense she could no longer afford. Their initial strategy was a dive into the digital ether, a world where Davies, despite his age, was a surprisingly adept navigator. For 3 sleepless nights, they haunted the university's computer labs, fueled by bitter coffee and a shared, burning sense of purpose. The glow of the monitors cast their faces in a pale, spectral light as they delved into the deep archives of architectural guilds, patent office databases, and old university servers. They were chasing a digital ghost, a faint electronic echo of Marcus Vance's career. But everywhere they turned, they found Finch's shadow. Project files that once bore her father's name had been overwritten. Digital watermarks had been altered. Metadata had been scrubbed and replaced. It was a masterclass in modern corporate espionage, a systematic campaign to digitally bury a man. Alara felt a growing sense of cold dread. It was one thing to know Finch was a thief. It was another to see the meticulous, patient, and utterly ruthless nature of his crime laid bare in lines of code. It was a digital assassination, and he had been brutally efficient, leaving behind a digital wasteland where her father's legacy should have been. The frustration was a physical weight, pressing down on Alara's shoulders. Every failed search, every access denied message, was another brick in the wall Finch had built around his crime. She watched the cursor blink on a blank search field, a tiny mocking heartbeat in the vast digital silence, and felt a wave of hopelessness so profound it threatened to drown her. Was this it? Was she to be defeated by a series of firewalls and encrypted files? It was Davies who pulled her back from the edge. He leaned back in his squeaking chair, the lines on his face deepening in the monitor's glow, and let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He explained that Finch, for all his modern ruthlessness, was a man of immense ego who fundamentally disdained the past. He would have focused all his energy on manipulating the digital world, the world of perception and media. He would have considered the physical world, the world of paper and ink and dust, to be beneath his notice. He would have archived it, buried it, and forgotten about it, confident that no one would ever have the will or the reason to go looking. The real evidence, Davies insisted, would not be on a server. It would be in a box, on a shelf, in a forgotten room, covered in a decade of dust. This realization shifted the entire focus of their investigation. Their battlefield was no longer the infinite sterile landscape of the internet, but the finite physical world of brick and mortar, specifically the archives of her father's old firm, Vance Architecture, which had been unceremoniously absorbed by Finch Global Properties after the hostile takeover. The building itself was a sleek, modern tower in the financial district, a fortress of glass and steel. Walking in the front door was impossible. They needed a key, a way to slip through the cracks of Finch's impenetrable corporate armor. They spent a full day simply observing from a coffee shop across the street, watching the building breathe. They noted the shift changes of the security guards, the arrival of the morning couriers, the departure of the evening cleaning crews. Alara, using her architect's mind, sketched the building's layout from memory and public records, identifying service entrances, elevator banks, and potential security blind spots. She was no longer just an engineer. She was becoming a tactician, planning an infiltration with the same precision she would use to calculate a structural load. The mission was no longer just about finding a document. It was about reclaiming a piece of her past, of entering the very space where her father had created his masterpieces. The breakthrough came not from a technical exploit, but from a human connection. Davies, after hours of poring over his old address book, made a single, hushed phone call. He spoke to a woman named Eleanor Vance, no relation, a quiet, unassuming woman who had been the head archivist at her father's firm for over 30 years. She had been kept on after the takeover, deemed too harmless and too knowledgeable about the filing system to be worth replacing. But Eleanor had been fiercely loyal to Marcus Vance. She had watched with silent, simmering rage as Finch dismantled everything he had built, replacing a culture of innovation and artistry with one of cutthroat corporate greed. She despised Alistair Finch with a passion that had been aging like a fine, bitter wine for nearly a decade. She was their insider. She was the ghost within the machine, the keeper of the company's memory, a memory Finch had tried so hard to erase. Her voice on the phone was quiet, trembling with a mixture of fear and a long-awaited surge of defiance. She was ready to help. Eleanor confirmed their suspicions. The physical records, everything deemed non-essential from the pre-Finch era, had been moved off-site to a deep storage facility in an industrial park in Queens. It was a corporate tomb, a place where inconvenient histories were sent to be forgotten. But she had the key. She provided them with the facility's address, the precise alphanumeric codex for the section containing all of Vance Architecture's pre-acquisition projects, and, most critically, a window of opportunity. The facility was scheduled for a full-day security system upgrade the following Friday. For several hours, the electronic surveillance would be down for diagnostics, and the facility would be relying on a skeleton crew of guards making predictable rounds. It was the perfect moment to slip in and out unnoticed. Eleanor also gave them a name, a contact at a temp agency who owed her a favor, someone who could create a temporary ID and work order that would get Alara through the front gate without raising suspicion. The pieces were falling into place, the fog of uncertainty beginning to clear, revealing a narrow, dangerous path forward. The plan they devised was one of quiet audacity, built not on force but on the very invisibility Alara had spent years perfecting. She would not be a cat burglar scaling walls or a hacker disabling laser grids. She would be a temporary records clerk, a nameless, faceless functionary sent to retrieve a forgotten file. She spent 2 days preparing for the role, the irony, a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. She was willingly putting the uniform back on, this time a drab gray polo shirt and ill-fitting khaki pants purchased from a discount store. She practiced a new posture, a slight slump to her shoulders, a way of averting her eyes to seem non-threatening and utterly forgettable. She was weaponizing the persona that had been forced upon her, turning the cloak of the servant into a tool of infiltration. Davies drilled her on the layout of the facility, on the codex, on the plausible excuses she could give if she were stopped. He was the general, and she was his sole field operative, preparing to go behind enemy lines. The mission was a gamble, a desperate roll of the dice, but it was the only move they had left. The storage facility was a monument to forgetting. A vast, windowless concrete box sitting in a desolate industrial park, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. The air inside was cold and still, smelling of aging paper, dust, and the faint, sterile scent of preservation chemicals. The only sound was the constant, low hum of the massive climate control system. Rows of towering metal shelves, 20 feet high, stretched into the dim, artificially lit distance, creating a labyrinth of numbered aisles. Each shelf was packed tight, with identical anonymous gray boxes, each one a coffin for a dead idea, a failed project, a forgotten piece of corporate history. As Alara, armed with her fake ID and a clipboard, walked into this silent, ordered necropolis, her heart hammered against her ribs, the sheer scale of the place was overwhelming. It was a physical manifestation of the haystack they were searching, and her father's legacy was the single, priceless needle hidden somewhere within its depths. She felt a profound sense of isolation, a lone archaeologist entering a tomb that had been sealed for a decade. Following Eleanor's precise instructions, She navigated the maze of shelves, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished concrete floor. The codex led her to a remote, little-visited section in the back corner of the warehouse. The boxes were coated in a thick layer of dust, untouched for years. Her hands trembled as she wiped the label on the first box. Vance Architecture, Project Files, 1998 to 2002. It was real. She was here. A wave of emotion, a mixture of grief and fierce determination, washed over her. She felt her father's presence in this cold, sterile place, his energy still clinging to these forgotten artifacts of his life's work. She pulled down the first heavy box, the cardboard groaning in protest, and carried it to a small, dusty work table under a flickering fluorescent light. Prying open the lid, she was greeted by the familiar, comforting smell of her father's drafting paper. It was like opening a time capsule, a portal back to a life she thought was gone forever. She was not just looking for evidence, she was reclaiming her own history. For hours she worked in the silent, dusty tomb, a solitary ghost sifting through the remains of a fallen kingdom. Box after box revealed a world she remembered vividly. Early sketches for projects that had won awards, notes from client meetings, drafts of speeches. Her fingers, smudged with dust, traced the lines of his elegant, precise handwriting. It was a painful, beautiful pilgrimage. Then, in the bottom of the fourth box, she found it. It was not a simple blueprint, but a magnificent, oversized leather portfolio, embossed with the gold initials MV. Her breath caught in her throat. She gently lifted it out and laid it on the table. With trembling hands, she untied the ribbon and opened it. Inside, perfectly preserved, were the original, hand-drawn, full schematic designs for the building that was to be his masterpiece. Not the Finch Apex Tower, but as it was christened in his own bold script at the bottom of the page, the Vance Meridian. And there, next to his full, proud signature, was the date, clear and undeniable, from 2 years before Alistair Finch had ever filed a patent. The discovery sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated triumph through her, a current of electricity that chased away the cold of the warehouse. This was it. The irrefutable proof. The origin story of the tower in her father's own hand. But as she carefully began to photograph each page with her phone, ensuring every detail was captured in high resolution, she found something even more valuable. Tucked into a sleeve in the portfolio were her father's private calculation notebooks. Dozens of pages filled with the complex, elegant mathematics that underpinned his revolutionary design. And there, highlighted and circled, were the specific equations for the harmonic damping system, the very one she had identified at the restaurant. His notes detailed, with prophetic accuracy, the catastrophic risks of altering the system's delicate balance, the very alterations Finch's cost-cutting engineers had made. It was not just the smoking gun, it was a signed confession. It was the scientific proof of Finch's criminal negligence. As she continued her search, her elation was tempered by a cold, rising anger. At the very bottom of the portfolio, she found a thin manila folder she hadn't noticed before. It was labeled simply, Finch. Inside was a collection of letters, a paper trail, documenting the birth and death of a partnership. The early correspondence was filled with a palpable sense of excitement, of two minds collaborating on a project that would change the world. But then the tone began to shift. She found letters from her father, his handwriting growing more tense, expressing deep, principled concerns over Finch's increasingly aggressive financial strategies and his proposals to use cheaper, inferior materials. The letters showed her father pleading with Finch not to compromise the artistic and structural integrity of the project for the sake of profit. He was fighting not just for his building, but for his very philosophy. The final document in the folder was a single sheet of paper. It was a legal notice of partnership dissolution, initiated by Finch, filled with fabricated accusations of professional misconduct against her father. It was the knife he had used to stab his partner in the back, the final, callous act of betrayal that had set her family's ruin in motion. photographing that final, damning letter. A silent fury unlike anything she had ever known solidified in her chest. This was no longer just about restoring her father's legacy or proving a structural flaw. This was about justice for a deeply personal, calculated act of cruelty. This was for the years her father had spent in silence, for the career he had lost, for the life that had been stolen from them. She had the complete story now, from the first line drawn on paper to the final, venomous legal document that had shattered their world. Just as she carefully placed the last letter back in the folder, a sound echoed through the cavernous space, cutting through the hum of the ventilation system. The sharp, metallic click of a door opening, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Her blood ran cold. A security guard, making an unscheduled round. Panic, sharp and electric, seized her for a split second before her training, her new, hard-won discipline, took over. She quickly closed the portfolio, slid it back into the box, and pushed the box back onto the bottom shelf, her movements swift and silent. She flattened herself into the narrow space between two towering shelves, pressing her body against the cold metal, trying to make herself as small as possible. The footsteps grew louder, closer. She could hear the jingle of keys on the guard's belt, the soft crackle of his radio. She held her breath, her lungs burning, her heart pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm against her ribs. The smell of dust and old paper was suffocating. She could see the beam of his flashlight cutting through the gloom, sweeping across the aisles, getting closer and closer to her hiding spot. For a terrifying moment, the beam paused, illuminating the very section of shelves she was hiding behind. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for discovery, for the shouting, for the inevitable failure of her mission. The image of her father, helpless in his bed, flashed in her mind. She could not fail. She would not fail. After what felt like an eternity, the beam moved on. The footsteps receded, growing fainter and fainter, until they were swallowed once again by the vast, humming silence of the warehouse. Alara remained frozen in place for a full 5 minutes, her body trembling with the adrenaline of the near miss. The experience had crystallized the true stakes of her fight. Alistair Finch was not just a corporate thief, he was a dangerous man, protected by layers of security, both physical and legal. He would not hesitate to crush anyone who threatened him. This was not a game. Slowly, cautiously, she emerged from her hiding place. She did not risk taking any of the physical documents. The photographs on her phone were her treasure, a digital ghost of the truth she could carry out with her. She made her way back through the labyrinth, her steps careful and deliberate, and slipped out of the facility as anonymously as she had entered. Walking out into the bright, harsh light of the afternoon, she felt like a diver surfacing from the deep, returning to the world of the living with a priceless pearl, a truth that had been lost to the darkness for years. Back in the sanctuary of the university library, she and Professor Davies huddled over a laptop, the images she had captured glowing on the screen. They watched in silence as the story unfolded. The beautiful, original designs, the brilliant, prophetic calculations, the friendly letters that curdled into warnings, the final, brutal betrayal. It was all there, a complete and utterly damning narrative. The evidence was ironclad, more powerful than they had ever dared to hope. But Davies, ever the strategist, knew that possessing the truth was not the same as deploying it. A simple leak to the press or a lawsuit would allow Finch to tie them up in court for years, to use his army of lawyers to discredit them, to bury the story under a mountain of legal motions and character assassinations. Finch's true power did not reside in the law. It resided in his carefully crafted public image as an untouchable visionary. To defeat him, they had to destroy the myth itself. The professor's eyes, which had been filled with the grim satisfaction of a scholar proving a theory, now gleamed with the light of a warrior planning his final assault. He pointed to a news feed on the screen. It was an announcement for the Finch Apex Tower's official topping out ceremony scheduled in 2 weeks. It was to be a massive media event, a celebration of Finch's supposed genius. broadcast live across every major news network. Alistair Finch would be on a stage, in front of the world, at the pinnacle of his triumph, delivering a speech about his singular vision. And that, Davies declared, his voice low and intense, was where they would strike. Not in a courtroom, not in a newspaper office, but on his own stage, under his own spotlight. They would turn his greatest moment of glory into his public execution. Ilara looked from the professor's determined face to the image of her father's signature on the screen. The fear she had felt in the warehouse was gone, replaced by a cold, clear, and absolute resolve. The investigation was over. The time for preparation had begun. She had the weapon, she had the ammunition, and now she had the perfect battlefield. The final confrontation was set, and she would be the one to orchestrate Alistair Finch's spectacular fall from grace. The day of the topping-out ceremony dawned cold and clear, the autumn sky a brilliant, unforgiving blue. The event was staged on a massive, custom-built platform at the base of the tower, a theatrical setting for Alistair Finch's coronation. A sea of expensive dark suits filled the VIP section. City officials, banking executives, real estate magnates, all gathered to pay homage to the man of the hour. A swarm of media crews formed a perimeter, their cameras aimed like artillery at the gleaming stage, the Finch Global Properties logo emblazoned on a massive screen behind the podium. To the world, this was a celebration of progress, a testament to one man's indomitable will. To Ilara Vance, standing in the anonymous crowd near the press section, it was a tribunal. She felt a strange, preternatural calm settle over her, the kind of stillness a master engineer feels moments before a controlled demolition. Every variable had been accounted for. Professor Davies was in a van 2 blocks away, a laptop open, ready to become a digital ghost in Finch's machine. The journalist, David Chen, stood among his colleagues, his press pass a key, his questions a carefully calibrated trigger. Ilara's heart did not race. It beat with a slow, steady, powerful rhythm, a metronome counting down the final seconds of Alistair Finch's reign. She was no longer a waitress, no longer a victim. She was the architect of his demise. Alistair Finch strode onto the stage to a crescendo of orchestrated applause, his smile a blinding display of predatory confidence. He was in his element, bathed in the adulation he believed was his birthright. He approached the podium, spreading his hands as if to embrace the city, the tower, the world itself. His speech began as a masterpiece of self-aggrandizement, a carefully woven narrative of struggle, vision, and ultimate triumph. He spoke of synergy and innovation, using the same tired jargon he had deployed at the restaurant, but here, in this forum, the words were received as gospel. He painted himself as a modern-day titan, a man who could bend steel and glass to his will, who could dream a new skyline into existence through sheer force of personality. As he spoke, Ilara's mind was a fortress of cold clarity. She did not hear the words of a visionary. She heard the hollow echo of a thief, a man reading stolen poetry and claiming it as his own. She watched him preen under the camera flashes, his arrogance, a radiant, blinding force, and she knew he was about to step directly into the trap she had so meticulously laid. He was so blinded by the light of his own ego that he would never see the darkness gathering at his feet. The speech reached its climax, and Finch opened the floor to a few pre-approved questions from the press. This was the signal. David Chen, the journalist from Aura, raised his hand, and Finch, recognizing a friendly face from what he surely remembered as a minor, forgotten incident, pointed to him with a magnanimous smile. Chen's question was a work of art, a piece of journalistic judo. He did not ask about Marcus Vance. He did not ask about structural flaws. He simply asked, with an air of professional curiosity, about the unique challenges of integrating the cantilevered sections with the harmonic damping system. A design element he noted was truly revolutionary. Finch's smile widened. It was the perfect softball, an invitation to pontificate on the very subject he knew the least about. As Finch launched into a rambling, technically incoherent answer, a jumble of misused terms and self-congratulatory nonsense. Professor Davies made his move. The massive screen behind Finch, which had been displaying a rotating gallery of glamorous architectural renderings, flickered for a single, almost imperceptible second. It was the only sign that the castle's digital gates had been breached. The king was on his throne, completely unaware that the walls were about to come down around him. As Finch paused for a dramatic breath, the image on the screen behind him changed. It was not a sudden, jarring cut, but a smooth, deliberate crossfade, as if it were part of the planned presentation. On the right side of the screen, one of Finch's own flawed blueprints appeared. On the left, an image materialized that sent a silent, seismic shockwave through the assembled crowd. It was a hand-drawn schematic, elegant and beautiful, its lines filled with an artistry that Finch's computer-generated designs completely lacked. At the bottom of the schematic, a bold, confident signature was visible to everyone: Marcus Vance. And next to it, a date, written in the same hand, from 2 years before Finch Global Properties had even announced the project. A low murmur rippled through the audience, a sound of confusion that quickly morphed into dawning suspicion. Finch, still facing the crowd, had not yet seen it. He was momentarily confused by the shift in the audience's attention, his smile faltering for the first time. In that moment of hesitation, Alara Vance stepped out from behind the press line and began to walk towards the stage, her steps measured, her purpose absolute. She did not run, she did not shout. She ascended the stairs to the stage with the calm authority of someone who belonged there, as if she were simply reclaiming her rightful place. The security guards, confused by her composure and the unfolding drama, hesitated for a fatal second. By the time they moved to intercept her, David Chen and several other journalists had surged forward, their cameras creating a barrier, their questions now a chorus of sharp, probing inquiries. Ilara walked directly to the podium, taking the secondary microphone as Finch stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. He finally turned and saw the screen, saw the ghost of the man he had destroyed looming behind him, and all the color drained from his face. When Ilara spoke, her voice was amplified by the powerful sound system, carrying across the plaza and into the live broadcast feeds reaching millions of viewers. It was the same voice she had used in the restaurant, a voice of crystalline clarity, of cold, irrefutable fact. She did not introduce herself as a waitress. She did not mention her firing. She simply said, "My name is Alara Vance," and with those 5 words, the world shifted on its axis. What followed was not an accusation, it was a lecture, a precise, methodical, and utterly devastating deconstruction of a man and his empire of lies. With the 2 blueprints displayed behind her like exhibits in a trial, she guided the audience through the evidence. She pointed to the elegant, original design on the left, explaining the genius of her father's work, his philosophy of creating buildings that were not just structures, but living, breathing entities. Then, her tone growing colder, she pointed to the modified design on the right. She explained the arrogant, cost-cutting changes Finch's team had made. Using the images of her father's own calculation notebooks, which now appeared on the screen, she proved, with the immutable language of mathematics, that these changes had introduced a fatal flaw. She described in chilling detail the catastrophic failure that would occur under predictable weather conditions, endangering not just the building's occupants, but thousands of lives in the surrounding city blocks. She turned Alistair Finch's monument to his own ego into a ticking time bomb, a threat to the very city he claimed to be championing. Finally, she presented the letters. The screen behind her now showed the correspondence between her father and Finch, the story of their partnership and its betrayal laid bare for the world to see. The early, hopeful collaborations. Her father's growing, desperate pleas to maintain the project's integrity. And then, the final, brutal letter of dissolution, filled with Finch's fabricated accusations. She did not need to raise her voice. The words on the screen, in her father's own hand, screamed for him. She had given a voice to his years of silence, and that voice was now an avenging chorus that echoed across the city. The audience was utterly silent, captivated by the raw, undeniable power of the truth. The investors stood frozen, their faces ashen, seeing their fortunes evaporating before their eyes. The city officials looked like men on their way to the gallows. Alistair Finch, exposed and eviscerated under the glare of the global spotlight, began to crumble. He snatched the microphone, his hand trembling, and tried to speak, but only a strangled, incoherent babble of denials and threats emerged. He was no longer a titan. He was a cornered, pathetic fraud, his carefully constructed universe collapsing into a black hole of his own making. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Ilara Vance finally exposed the truth. The aftermath was a corporate apocalypse. Alistair Finch was escorted from the stage, not by his adoring security team, but by city police officers, his final image broadcast to the world one of utter, pathetic humiliation. His empire, built on a foundation of lies, imploded with breathtaking speed. Investors pulled out, launching a tidal wave of lawsuits that would drown his company in litigation for years. The city slapped a stop-work order on the tower, its skeletal frame now a monument not to ambition but to fraud and hubris. Criminal charges were filed, corporate espionage, intellectual property theft, and, most seriously, reckless endangerment on a scale that was almost unprecedented. The media, led by a now famous David Chen, relentlessly uncovered every dirty secret, every corrupt deal, every life Finch had ruined on his climb to the top. He was stripped of everything, his company, his fortune, and the one thing he valued most, his reputation. He became a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms, a symbol of the fatal flaw of arrogance. In the wake of the scandal, a new story began to emerge. A consortium of ethical developers, a firm that had long respected Marcus Vance and despised Finch's predatory tactics, stepped in to buy the project out of receivership. Their first official act was not to meet with bankers or city planners, but to arrange a quiet meeting with Ilara Vance. They did not see a former waitress. They saw the rightful heir to a masterpiece, a brilliant engineer with a moral authority that could not be purchased. They offered her not just a job, but a partnership. They asked her to take a senior executive role, to lead the team that would correct the flaws and complete the tower exactly as her father had originally envisioned it. They would not call it the Finch Apex. They would christen it with its rightful name, the Vance Meridian. And to ensure that such a theft could never happen again, they worked with her to establish the Marcus Vance Foundation for Ethical Architecture, an institution dedicated to funding and protecting the next generation of visionaries. Ilara's life transformed. The crushing weight of her father's medical bills vanished, replaced by the resources to provide him with the best care science and medicine could offer. She moved him to a state-of-the-art facility with a view of the city, where he could watch his own dream finally, and correctly, reaching for the sky. She traded her waitress uniform for a hard hat and blueprints, her days spent not in a gilded restaurant, but on the construction site of her father's legacy. Her voice now one of command and respect. She had not sought revenge, she had sought justice, and in doing so, she had found her own purpose, a purpose that honored her past while building a better future. She had reclaimed not just her father's name, but her own. The world no longer looked through her, they looked up to her, a titan of industry forged not in the fires of greed, but in the crucible of love, loyalty, and an unshakable belief in the truth. Months later, on a crisp spring afternoon, Ilara stood on the balcony of her father's room. The Vance Meridian was nearly complete, its elegant, sweeping lines a beacon of integrity against the skyline. Her father sat in a wheelchair beside her, his body still frail, but his eyes, for the first time in years, held a clear, lucid light. She described the final stages of the construction, the installation of the very damping system he had designed, and as she spoke, his hand found hers, his grip surprisingly firm. A single tear traced a path through the lines on his weathered cheek. a silent testament to a gratitude and pride too deep for words. She had not just saved his building, she had saved him. She had proven that dignity is not defined by a uniform or a job title, but by the courage to speak truth to power. She had shown the world that even the tallest towers built on foundations of lies will eventually crumble, and that a legacy built on genius and love, when defended by a righteous heart, can never truly be destroyed. If Ilara Vance's incredible journey from an invisible waitress to an unstoppable force for justice inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see that courage and truth can change the world. And for more unforgettable stories of righteous vindication and the triumph of the human spirit, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss a moment of justice being served.